Zechariah chapter 11. This is not necessarily a long chapter, but there's quite a bit of information packed into these verses. So I'll try to move through this quickly tonight, but there's a lot of good stuff here to get through. So Zechariah chapter 11, starting verse number 1, we read, "Open thy doors, O Lebanon, that the fire may devour thy cedars. Howl, fir tree, for the cedar is fallen, because the mighty are spoiled. Howl, O you oaks of Bashan, for the forest of the vintage has come down. There is a voice of the howling of the shepherds, for their glory is spoiled. A voice of the roaring of young lions, for the pride of Jordan is spoiled. Thus saith the Lord of God, feed the flock of the slaughter, whose possessors slay them and hold themselves not guilty. And they that sell them say, Blessed be the Lord, for I am rich, and their own shepherds pity them not. For I will no more pity the inhabitants of the land, saith the Lord, but lo, I will deliver the men, every one into his neighbor's hand, and into the hand of his king, and they shall smite the land, and out of their hand I will not deliver them. And I will feed the flock of the slaughter, even you, O poor, the flock, and I took unto me 2 staves, the one I called Beauty, and the other I called Bands, and I fed the flock. 3 shepherds also I cut off in 1 month, and my soul loathed them, and their soul also abhorred me. And then said I will not feed you. That dieth, let it die, and that is to be cut off, let it be cut off, and let the rest eat, every one the flesh of another. And I took my staff, even Beauty, and cut it asunder, that I might break my covenant which I had made with all the people. And it was broken in that day, and so the poor of the flock that waited upon me knew that it was the word of the Lord. And I said unto them, If you think good, give me my price, and if not, forbear. And so they weighed for me, or weighed for my price, 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said unto me, Cast it unto the potter, a goodly price that I was prized of them. And I took the 30 pieces of silver, and cast them to the potter in the house of the Lord. And then I cut asunder mine other staff, even Bands, that I might break the brotherhood between Judah and Israel. And the Lord said unto me, Take unto thee yet the instruments of a fullest shepherd. And for lo, I will raise up a shepherd in the land, which shall not visit those that be cut off, neither shall seek the young one, nor heal that is broken, nor feed that standeth still. But he shall eat the flesh of the fat, and tear their claws in pieces. And woe to the idle shepherd that leaveth the flock. The sword shall be upon his arm, and upon his right eye. His arm shall be clean dried up, and his right eye shall be utterly darkened." What we have here in chapter 11 is the story of 3 shepherds. And so this chapter is really all about shepherds, and it revolves around, the largest section of this chapter revolves around the true shepherd, or the good shepherd, and Israel's rejection of that shepherd. I'll quote Charles Feinberg. He said, "Preceding the fulfillment of the prophecies of blessing are the apostasy of Israel and their rejection of the good shepherd, their Messiah, with the consequent visitation of God upon them in dire punishment." And so that's really what we see here in chapter 11. And so it begins here with the picture of judgment by describing the destruction of the cedars of Lebanon, the oaks of Bashan, and then the Jordan. It says the Jordan is spoiled. Now, what seems to be taking place here is Zechariah seems to be using these natural landmarks, these cedars, the oaks. These were well known with regards to their location. The cedars of Lebanon. And they weren't just any cedars. It was the cedars of Lebanon. These cedars were known. Again, it wasn't just any oaks. It was the oaks of Bashan. These were known. And so Zechariah is giving us points of emphasis by referring to trees and rivers that are known by their location. And I think the reason he's doing this is basically a personification of these things to relate to us locales. Not necessarily, the emphasis isn't cedars and oaks, but where those cedars and oaks are. And so he's giving us kind of a pathway. And so if you relate these things in relation to their location to Israel, you would say that the Lebanon is north of Israel, and then you come down Bashan, kind of on the eastern side, making its way down to the Jordan area along its eastern border. And so he's giving a pathway for something. Something we'll talk about just here in a second. So this destruction was going to lead to the first shepherd. That's the howling shepherd. And so the first shepherd is the howling shepherd, and there would be the howling of the shepherds, and there would be the roaring of young lions. Essentially, man and nature alike is going to mourn in devastation over the judgment that God's going to bring. And so most commentators, and I'm fully in agreement here, most commentators believe that this is a prophecy concerning the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. I'll quote here James Boyce. He said, "These verses might have described the Babylonian invasion if they had been written earlier, but that was past history by Zechariah's time. There is nothing in the history of the people that a comprehensive destruction of the land can refer to prior to the terrible destruction ordered by Vespasian and his successor Titus." And so we understand that the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD was not only a historic event, it was a historic event, but it had significant implications for the people of Israel. It has significant implications, scripturally speaking. It's referred to several times in Scripture. It was a prophesied event, and so just from that standpoint, it is significant in that it was a fulfillment of prophecy. But also what we are going to see, and I think this chapter brings us out probably better than any other in Scripture, is that that particular event in 70 AD, the destruction of Jerusalem and specifically the temple, it was a direct divine judgment by God upon the nation of Israel, specifically because of their rejection of Jesus as the Messiah. Make no mistake about it. I do not believe it is any coincidence at all that they reject Jesus as their Messiah, and then just a few decades later, their nation is ravaged. Their temple is destroyed. Their way of life is done away with. And so this, again, I think we'll see this very clearly. If all we have are the first few verses, I don't know that we'd see this as clear, but you have to take it in relation to the chapter as a whole, and I think it becomes more clear at that point. And so the reason this judgment would come would be because of the rejection of the good shepherd. And so that leads us to the second shepherd, and this is the lengthiest portion of this particular chapter. And so you see in verse 4, he says, "Thus saith the Lord my God, feed the flock of the slaughter." Feed the flock of the slaughter. And so what happens here then is God asks Zechariah to essentially become a living prophecy or a living illustration. This is something that God did with a number of the prophets. He did it with Isaiah. He did it with Jeremiah. I think probably most notably, he did this with Hosea, actually going so far as to have Hosea marry a woman and as an illustration of God's relationship with his people. And so at times God did this where he asked the prophets to kind of live out an illustration so that the people could see this. And he does this here with Zechariah. Now what becomes tricky here, down through verse 14, is Zechariah is living this out. He actually became a shepherd. But in doing so, what he's doing is he's pointing forward. All right, everything that he does as the shepherd is a sign or a foreshadowing of what Christ was going to come and do. And so he speaks here in the first person because he's doing it. He was living the life of a shepherd, but it's pointing us forward to Christ. And so you got to keep that in mind as we go forward here. And so he says, "Thus saith the Lord God, feed the flock of the slaughter." And then he gives us a little bit of an aside here. Verses 5 and 6 kind of you almost think of it as a parenthetical section. And so verse 5 it says, whose possessors slay them and hold themselves not guilty. And they that sell them say, "Blessed be the Lord, for I am rich." And their own shepherds pity them not. For I will no more pity the inhabitants of the land, saith the Lord. But lo, I will deliver them and every one into his neighbor's hand, and into the hand of his king. And they shall smite the land, and out of their hand I will not deliver them. And so verses 5 and 6, again, kind of an aside from the rest of the flow of the text here. And so he's called to tend to this flock, right? But specifically, not just any flock, but the flock of the slaughter. And so this is an interesting designation. They would be, the flock would be those who were sold to those who were going to kill them, and yet kill them and have within them no sense of guilt. They didn't see anything that they were doing as wrong. And God was going to deliver them into the hand of their neighbor, who would smite the land. And he says, "And out of their hand I will not deliver them." God knows this is coming. In fact, God providentially brought this judgment. And so he's not going to deliver them. This was delivered up for them for the purposes of judgment. And so Zechariah, playing the part of the Messiah, comes to tend to the flock before their judgment. Right? That's the key here in verse 4. Right? Go feed the flock of the slaughter before the actual slaughter takes place. Right? And so just from a chronological standpoint, this is significant because this is exactly what Christ did. What did Christ say about himself? Christ said that he was come to the lost sheep of Israel. Right? This is what Christ himself said he came to do. And yet what did those lost sheep do? They rejected him as their shepherd. And after the rejection of their shepherd, what happened? They were sold into the hands of their neighbor, and Rome came down in judgment upon them in the year 70 A.D. But not only that, but specifically, interestingly enough, look at the end of verse 6. And I didn't put this in here because there's too much to get to. But at the end of verse 6, he says, into the hand of his neighbor's hand and into the hand of his king. He's going to deliver him into his neighbor's hand, but also into the hand of his king. And so, interestingly enough here, you have neighbor and king are one and the same. And you think, well, how can that be? How can your neighbor be your king? Well, think about what happened around the time of Christ's death. The Jews delivered him up to the Romans, and what did they say? Right? They said, he's trying to make insurrection, and he's trying to stir up trouble and strife against Rome. And what did Pilate say? Pilate said what? I present to you your king. Right? This is your king. What did he put above his head? King of the Jews. And do you remember what the Jews said? We have no king but Caesar. That's what they said at the death of Christ. We have no king but Caesar. And so in that position, Caesar became their neighbor, but also their king, because they rejected the true king. They rejected the good shepherd. And so here he comes to them in verse 4 to feed them before the slaughter. Jesus comes to the lost sheep of Israel. And then the slaughter comes later. Now, here in verse 7, in that role, when he comes to the lost sheep, in that role, he says, I took 2 staves, and that word just means staff. I took 2 staffs, one of them named beauty, and the other one named bands. Now, the word beauty means favor or pleasantness. That word bands means that exactly. It means to band together, but, to unify is the thought there. And so this speaks of the overall ministry of that shepherd, of that good shepherd, one who would come in beauty to bind the lost sheep together. All right, that's why he came. Now, obviously, they rejected him, and they rejected that ministry. But that's why he came. And so that leads us to verse 8. Now, verse 8 is widely interpreted, and I do mean widely. There's a lot of thoughts on verse number 8. There would be no time to even go through all the different ideas that have come about from verse 8. And so he says, 3 shepherds also I cut off in 1 month, and my soul loathed them, and their soul also abhorred me. And so again, here you have Zechariah living out this example of the shepherd, and he says, 3 shepherds also I cut off in 1 month. And so the questions then arise. Right? It is debated. Is this something that Zechariah actually did? In the period of 1 month, did Zechariah kill 3 other shepherds? Or is this something that is entirely symbolic? If it is something that was done literally, is it just something that Zechariah had to do in his role? Or is it something that happened literally but had a symbolic meaning behind it, pointing to some aspect of the ministry of Christ? All in all, I don't think there's anything I could bring that would tell you whether or not this is something that literally happened with Zechariah, or if this is something that's solely figurative or symbolic. But the interpretation that makes the most sense to me, and that's just the best I can go off of, is that the 3 men here, whether or not this is something that Zechariah literally did or not, but the 3 shepherds here are symbolic and representative of the 3 groups of Israel's leadership. The 3 groups of Israel's leadership who were responsible and the spur behind the hostility towards Christ. And he says there, their soul also abhorred me. Now I want you to notice there that as Zech says, and my soul loathed them. And that word loathe carries with it the idea of patience. Essentially, the shepherd here, the good shepherd here, eventually lost his patience. Now, not in a sinful manner. You got to understand, God is long-suffering. And as we've talked about this in the past, God is long-suffering, but there's a point where a mercy and long-suffering turns into a license for sin. And God doesn't give people a license for sin. He is merciful. He is long-suffering. But he will not give you a license to sin. And so Jesus was patient with the leadership of Israel, but there came a certain point where judgment was going to be delivered, and of course that comes later. But you see here that they abhorred him. They hated him. They hated everything about him. We saw that a little bit as we made our way through the Gospel of Mark, right? The religious leadership of Israel at that time could not have hated Christ more, because he represented everything that they were against. He was a picture of everything that they were against. He was for everything that God was, because he was God in the flesh, and they were for complete nothing but selfish. They did for themselves, and so they hated him, and they hated not only his message, but they hated the fact that he was turning a percentage of the population against them because of the things that they were doing. So they hated him. And so then, if that's the case there, then what does the month refer to? I don't know, other than possibly just a short amount of time. We don't know for sure. But Luke 9, I think, is a potent verse here. Luke 9:22, it says, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected." And here you see those three groups. "And be rejected of the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be slain and raised the third day." And so, again, to me, I think that's what verse 8 is. I could be totally wrong on that. But I think that's at least as of right now, that's the one that makes the most sense to me. Now, to those who didn't believe and trust in him, this is where you get to verse 9. He says, "Then said I will not feed you. That dieth, let it die. And that is to be cut off, let it be cut off. And let the rest eat every one the flesh of another." And so for those who didn't believe and trust in that good shepherd who was to come, he gave them over. This was judgment. And this is why I say 70 AD is a significant event. When Titus comes and leads his army and destroys Jerusalem and carries off the implements of the temple, this is a significant historical event, theological event, because this was judgment against the people who rejected Jesus as God, rejected Jesus as their Messiah, and so he gave them over, right? That dieth, let it die. This is where he said, I'm not going to come in. I'm not going to stop this. My hand is stayed from deliverance in this particular event. And he specifically says there in verse 9, he says, "And let the rest eat every one the flesh of another." Well, historically, and Josephus writes about this, they did this during the siege of Jerusalem. They did this. They cannibalized one another during that particular siege. And the things that Josephus writes about during that particular time are absolutely terrible. I mean, just ungodly things that it's hard to even read some of it. But this is something that they did historically during that particular time. And then verse 10, he says, "And I took my staff, even beauty, and cut it asunder, that I might break my covenant which I made with all the people." That's an important phrase. And so Zechariah takes the staff, beauty, particularly beauty, and he breaks it. And he says that I might break my covenant. Now, this is an interesting phrase. So again, everything Zechariah is doing is pointing us towards Christ. So here he is as a foreshadow of what Christ is going to come to do, breaking a covenant. Now, we've got to understand this, because God doesn't break his promises. And we've got to understand that God made some unconditional promises in the Old Testament. He has unconditional covenants with the people of Israel. Unconditional covenants, meaning he's not going to break his end of that agreement. Right? He has unconditional covenants with Abraham. He's had unconditional covenants with David. Right? These covenants that are not going to be broken. And so obviously that's not what this is a reference to. You couldn't come to a verse like verse 10 and say, well, here it is. This is why the church now replaces Israel, because God no longer holds to those covenants. Well, then you're calling God a liar, and I've got a big problem with that. But notice, he doesn't say that he's going to break the covenant which he had with Israel. That's not what he says. The covenant that I have with all the people. People there meaning nations. And so this was a global covenant that God had with the world, essentially. Now, nowhere in the text, or in the Scripture, rather, nowhere in the Scripture do we have the description of this particular covenant. Nowhere in the Scriptures do we have us told to us that this was an unconditional covenant. In other words, this was a conditional covenant which God could break and still be an arbiter of truth. And so this particular covenant seems to be, again, we can't be definitive on this, but this particular covenant seems to be one of protection and care. In other words, he has a covenant with the world that says, I'm going to protect my people, Israel being. And obviously 70 A.D. would mark God moving away from that. Now he's going to come back to that. The covenant was broken, but it was not done away with. That covenant is going to come back into play at a later point. But as of now, we're standing at a point where God is no longer holding up that end of the covenant. And so by breaking the staff, this was Zechariah's way of showing he's terminating his position as shepherd. Right? He's no longer the shepherd. And so he comes to whoever was responsible for his overseers, and he basically says, I'm terminating a position. If you see fit to pay me, pay me. If not, don't. And it says that they give him 30 pieces of silver. Well, obviously, if you understand the New Testament, that is already ringing bells in your ear. But he says, I'm asking for my price. And so he says they weighed for my price 30 pieces of silver. Well, obviously, this is exactly foretelling what happened to Christ. And so just like Christ, the people had no appreciation or love for the ministry of Zechariah. And because they had no appreciation or love for his ministry, they give him the common pay, not just for a slave. You've probably heard before that 30 pieces of silver was the price of a slave. That's true, but it's more specific than that. 30 pieces of silver is the price of a gored slave, a slave who had been gored by an ox. So we're not talking about a slave who could actually go out and do good work. We're talking about this is the price of the lowest of the low, not just a slave, a gored slave, a slave who can't even do his job anymore. And so this is how lowly of a value they place upon the ministry here of Zechariah, and then later the betrayal of Judas. And so, Christ, or rather here they give 30 pieces of silver to Zechariah. In the New Testament, they give Judas 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus. But then he goes on to say, and again the similarities are still there, he says, and I said to them, or verse 13, sorry. He says, and the Lord said unto me, cast it unto the potter, speaking of the 30 pieces of silver, cast it unto the potter, a goodly price that I was prized out of them, and I took the 30 pieces of silver and cast them to the potter in the house of the Lord. Well, it's the exact same thing that happens. You understand the story. After Judas betrays Christ, he gets the 30 pieces of silver. He begins to feel guilty about what he did. He goes into the temple and basically just throws the 30 pieces of silver down. Well, the chief priests, the elders, those three groups we talked about earlier, they don't know what to do with this. They gather up the money and they think, well, we can't put it in the treasury. This is blood money. Right? If questions are asked about this money, we don't want to be given those answers. Right? And so we don't know what to do with this. And so the text says that they take that 30 pieces of silver and they go and they buy the field from a potter. Right? And so again, here we have exactly portraying what was going to take place with the rejection and the betrayal of Christ in the New Testament. And so Zechariah then breaks the other staff. He then breaks the other staff. Verse 14, he says, and then I cut asunder mine other staff, even bands, that I might break the brotherhood between Judah and Israel. Remember, bands being the one that was for unity. That's what it represented. And now he breaks it, and now there is no unity. And of course, we still see that today. There is no unity amongst the Jewish people. It's really a sad thing, but this is something that we're still seeing represented in our world today. And so Constable, he said that the order of events is significant, and it was historical. The breaking of God's favor on his people, their rejection of the shepherd, and the breaking of their unity. He says, we know that this destruction will not be permanent, however, because of the other promises that God will reunite and restore his people, and that he will not cast them off permanently. And then look here at the end, because there's a progression, right? God raises up the good shepherd to feed this flock that was for slaughter, and then the flock rejects that good shepherd, and then there's the betrayal, there's the 30 pieces of silver, and then there's another shepherd. There's another shepherd at the end of the chapter here, verse 15. He says, and the Lord said unto me, take unto thee yet the instruments of a foolish shepherd. And so there's a third shepherd, there's a foolish shepherd. And so he now has Zechariah reprise this role. Now what are the implements of a foolish shepherd? We don't know. We're not told. But in some way, shape, or form, Zechariah made it known to the people around him that he was now representing a foolish shepherd. And so exactly how he did that, we're not told. But then verse 16 tells us a little bit about this foolish shepherd. It says, for lo, I will raise up a shepherd in the land which shall not visit those that be cut off, neither shall seek the young one, nor heal that is broken, nor feed that standeth still, but he shall eat the flesh of the fat and tear their claws in pieces. And so unlike that shepherd, unlike the good shepherd, this particular shepherd shows no care or concern for the people. Remember, the former shepherd, he came to tend to that flock. He was sent to that flock, to protect that flock, to watch over that. This shepherd's not going to do that. He doesn't do anything that a good shepherd would do. And so instead of feeding them, instead of protecting them, instead of caring for them, all the things that a good shepherd would do for the flock he's in charge of, it says, he shall eat the flesh of the fat and tear their claws in pieces. And so in his greed, he will slaughter, kill, and consume the very sheep he was supposed to protect. Now, you probably understand where I'm going with this. But questions arise as to who this represents. Now, perhaps, just to give us a broadest sense possible, perhaps it represents many, or you could even say all, the bad leaders that Israel's ever had. Whether that's true or not, I wouldn't definitively say that, but what I will definitively say is that it finds its ultimate fulfillment in the Antichrist. And so again, look at the progression. You have the good shepherd. He comes and he tends to the flock, is rejected, and then after that you have the foolish shepherd. And so you have a historical chronology here. And so this, I think, clearly speaks to us of the Antichrist. This man is going to sign a treaty with Israel for 7 years. I know there's a whole lot of Bible that we could be throwing at this, but this man will sign a treaty with Israel for 7 years. We know that from the book of Daniel. Then halfway through that particular treaty, he's going to break that treaty with them. And whereas the flock that he signed a treaty to protect, to watch over, he will now turn on them. He will consume them. He will begin to kill them. And we'll see a lot more about that actually as we finish up the book of Zechariah over the next couple of chapters. Just how bad it's going to be for that flock at that time. But this is, again, obviously pushing us forward to the Antichrist. But then we see his end. Verse 17. He says, woe to the idle shepherd. Now, first he was the foolish shepherd. Now he's the idle shepherd. Woe to the idle shepherd that leaveth the flock. He said, the sword shall be upon his arm and upon his right eye. His arm shall be clean dried up, and his right eye shall be utterly darkened. His arm, speaking of his power and authority. His right eyes in Scripture oftentimes speak of intelligence. And so his power is going to be done away with. His intelligence is going to be gone. His dominion, here's what ultimately it is. His dominion is over. His dominion is over. And of course, we read about this in Revelation chapter 19. It says, and the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, with which he deceived them that had received the mark of the beast, and them that worshipped his image. And these both were cast alive into a lake of fire, burning with brimstone. And that is the ultimate end of the foolish, idle shepherd. And all of it comes to pass because of the rejection of the good shepherd.